To make the pocket flap, you will bag out the 2 pocket flap pieces. This means to sew the 2 pieces right sides together around the edges and then turn the pieces right side out so that the seam allowance gets hidden inside. Find the 2 pieces labeled pocket flap. Press if needed. Using a single thread trace the fold line of each piece. Use a tailor's tack instead of a knot at the beginning and end to hold your thread in place. Decide which of your pocket flap pieces will be the inside of the finished pocket flap. Place this piece with the wrong side down on the cutting table. Place the other piece with the wrong side up, the right side facing the right side of the other piece on top of it. Use a pin to match up the top and bottom pieces at the intersection of the fold and stitch lines on one side. Hold the pin straight up and down. Use a second pin started at an angle to pin in place. Repeat at the intersection of the fold and stitch line on the opposite side. In the same manner, pin the top corners and notches in place as well. Pin horizontally along the stitch lines, being sure that the 2 stitch lines are matched. Do this from the start of the fold line across the top to the end of the fold. Across the bottom edge of the pocket flap, we want to skew the seam slightly. This way, the seam will end up rolled to the back of the pocket flap. Push the top layer of fabric in towards the center about 1/16 of an inch. Pin the 2 layers together, but place the pin about 1/16 of an inch outside the stitch line on the top layer. When you pin through, the pin should come out the same distance inside the stitch line on the bottom layer. Continue to pin just outside the line on the top layer and just inside the line on the bottom layer until you've rounded the corner on each side. Place the pin between the corner and the fold line so that you can sew the fold line matched but be 1/16 of an inch away from the line before you round the corner. Because the corners are so tightly curved, do not hesitate to use 2 or 3 pins along the curve. This will help keep the top layer of fabric from shifting as you manipulate the fabric around the curve. Double check your pinning before sewing. The lines should match across the top from fold line to fold line. Beginning at the fold line, the pin should be 1/16 of an inch below the line on the bottom layer and 1/16 of an inch above the line on the top layer. Because we have pushed the top layer in, the top layer of fabric will no longer lie flat. Do not worry about this so long as the stitch line itself is lying flat. Set the sewing machine to a stitch width of 0 and a stitch length of 3. Place the pocket flap under the presser foot with the rightmost vertical pin lined up directly below the needle. Lower the presser foot and remove the pin. Hold the 2 beginning threads and sew forward 2 or 3 stitches. Backstitch 2 or 3 stitches and continue sewing on the line. When you reach the corner, stop, turn the hand wheel until the needle is in the down position, lift the presser foot and turn the fabric to line up the continuing stitch line with the center of the presser foot. Put the presser foot down and continue sewing. Do the same when you reach the corner where the fold line connects with the stitch line. Continue stitching past the fold line, but begin to follow the position of your pins instead of the actual stitch line. You should now be beginning to sew just outside the stitch line. Continue to sew following the pin line until you reach the intersection of the fold line and the stitch line on the other side. By the time you reach that intersection, you should be sewing again directly on the stitch line that is drawn. Stop and turn the corner and continue sewing on the stitch line to the next corner. Continue sewing until you reach the vertical pin marking the other notch. Backstitch, make sure the needle is in the upright position, lift the presser foot and remove the work. Be sure to clip your threads from both sides and both ends. Check that your fabric has not shifted while you've sewn. If needed, remove any stitching that is not in the right place, repin and resew. Now you are ready to trim the seam allowance around the curves down to just 1/4 of an inch. To further reduce the bulk of this seam allowance, we're going to clip out 3 small triangles from the seam allowance. Be sure to cut near the seam, but not through the stitching itself. Repeat along the other curve. Now you are ready to turn the pocket flap right side out. Reach in through the gap in the seam and pull and push the corners out through the opening. Use a blunt point to gently push the corners and edges completely out. Use the point of the iron to carefully press the edges of the pocket flap. The seam should be right along the edge, along the top of the pocket flap. Along the bottom of the pocket flap, the seam should roll to the back just slightly. Both layers of the pocket flap should now lie flat against one another. Be sure the fabric is lying completely flat and there are no creases or folds, especially around the seam line. You are ready to top stitch around the edges. Set your machine to a stitch width of 0 and a stitch length of 3.5. Pin the opening along the top closed. Place the pocket flap underneath the presser foot at the middle of the opening. Line up the edge of the pocket with the inner edge of the presser foot. Hold the 2 threads and begin stitching using the inner edge of the presser foot to sew about a 1/16 of an inch from the edge of the fabric. Sew until you reach the corner. Be sure your needle is in the downright position, lift your presser foot and turn the corner. Continue sewing to the next corner. Continue in this fashion until you reach where you began. When you reach where you began, be sure your starting threads are out of the way so they do not get tangled in the stitching. Stitch until you have passed where you began by 2 or 3 stitches. Backstitch, make sure your needle is in the upright position and remove your work. Clip the threads flush. Using the iron, press the top of the pocket flap towards the wrong side along the thread traced fold line. You have finished the pocket flap and are ready to move on to the gathered pocket.